Hi, Evan.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show on meaningoflife.tv. And you are Evan Thompson, a philosopher at the University of British Columbia and author of, among other things, this book. I have the Kindle version, so I can't hold up the book per se, but cover looks. Whoops! I have to say no. Don't go to that location. So looks kind of like that through a cracked smartphone screen. Waking, Dreaming, Being is the name of the book, published by Columbia University Press, I think. Very ambitious book, very interesting book. You kind of closely examine in the book various states of consciousness: ordinary waking consciousness, dreaming, lucid dreaming, out of body experiences, near death experiences. And the overall goal is to shed light on the nature of consciousness and the nature of what we call the self. And the book starts, I would say, on kind of a Buddhist note, both because the foreword is written by I think Stephen Batchelor, who's known as something of a Buddhist, and also because you start out the introduction by saying that you hope to establish that the self, what we think of as the self, is more of a process than a thing, and that sounds kind of Buddhist. But it turns out your kind of philosophical backdrop for this is really broader than Buddhism per se, right? It's generally Eastern. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I draw on Indian philosophy, and that includes Buddhism, but also includes Vedanta and yoga. And there's a section where I use some ideas from Taoism, and then I use a lot of things from Western philosophy. So I think of it as cross-cultural philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you had experience in this before you tackled this particular exploration? I mean, do you practice meditation or?
I do. I've practiced different kinds of meditation at different points in my life. I grew up in a kind of alternative environment in the 1970s where I was exposed to a lot of different ideas in the science, religion, science, spirituality dialogue. My undergraduate degree was in Asian studies, Chinese language and history, got my PhD in philosophy, worked a lot with the Mind and Life Institute, which is the organization that brings together the Dalai Lama and Buddhist scholars and scientists to talk about mind and brain and self. And so I've been involved in this kind of work for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so you take the vantage point of Eastern philosophy and reflection going way back, because they've been talking about consciousness for a long, long time, going back before the Buddhist time even. And then you also make reference to modern kind of neuroscience, brain imaging, and so on. Mm-hmm. So I want to, in the course of this, I would like to run over, these various states of consciousness, dreaming, lucid dreaming, and ask you what you learn from them. But why don't we start with ordinary consciousness? How do you, everyday awareness, how do you break that down?
Yeah. So I talk about everyday, ordinary waking consciousness as a consciousness that involves a sense of self that's very much grounded on the body and perception and sensory motor interaction with the environment through the body. And that's especially prominent when we're involved in some absorbed task, whether it's, typing at a keyboard or playing tennis or dancing. But then that sense of awareness, and particularly the sense of self, because I'm interested in how the sense of self shifts across different modes of consciousness. The sense of self shifts when we, say, mind wander or daydream or get caught up in some train of thought that involves an image of ourselves drawn from memory or some image of ourselves that we project into the future. And so the sense of self there is very much a mentally represented sense of self, an image of self that involves what psychologists call time travel, the ability to project ourselves into the past and forward into the future. And that that ensues in, say, daydreaming or mind wandering in a way that shifts our sense of self away from that kind of immediate embodied sense of self. It's not as if we become disembodied, of course, but our orientation shifts towards a mental content away from our immediate environment. So that constant back and forth between those different modes with an attention that jumps around, I would say, is characteristic of waking consciousness.
Okay. So ordinary consciousness is actually a number of different kinds of consciousness. with various kinds of senses of self implied,
Right.
including sometimes not much of one, right? When you're really absorbed in something, what would you say is happening there? When you're so engrossed in a task that you're just not thinking about yourself?
Yeah, so there I would say that there isn't an introspective or reflective sense of self. There's not a self-monitoring sense of self, but there is a sense of subjectivity, of immersion as a bodily being in some activity, and I include that in the forms that self-experience can take. So it's not a let's say it's not a metacognitive sense of self necessarily, where you're reflecting on your thought processes, but it is a sense of being involved in an activity in a way that's intentional or deliberate, even when we're highly skilled, I would say. Highly skilled in something like dancing or skiing. People talk about, in flow states, the sense of self dropping out, but often what they really mean by that is the mental sense of self, because those activities are highly skilled and you're highly attuned to the way your body is responding to the environment. So I count that as part of the sense of self, the embodied or bodily sense of self.
Of course, some people would say when you rule out they would say all they mean by a sense of self is the mental self. Whereas you earlier said something about grounded in the body, consciousness or awareness, I think, being grounded in the body. And you are associated with something called embodied cognition, a kind of a school of thought. And I've honestly never understood totally what that is. I've asked a few people to tell me, and they've never quite penetrated my brain with their answers. Is it kind of an elusive thing that people who don't appreciate the world view have trouble grasping? Or what would you say about embodied cognition?
Well, I would say, unfortunately, the word embodied can be used in a lot of different ways. The way that I use it when I talk about embodied cognition is that bodily processes, particularly sensory motor interaction with the environment, is crucial for various kinds of cognitive processes. So it's not as if there's a kind of amodal computational process that's located in the brain, and that's what cognition is. That cognition depends on sensory motor activity and sensory motor emulation of sensory motor activity. Some people use the expression grounded cognition for this, the idea that it's grounded in sensory motor processes. So that's how I use embodied when I talk about embodied cognition.
So there's always, so in other words, our awareness always involves and is influenced by either kind of like, muscular movements and what my limbs are doing, or at least the neurological kind of representate the parts of the brain that tend to be associated with those movements. Is that?
That's right. So in perception, the idea, say in visual perception, would be that that eye movements and head movements and whole body movements are actually part of the perceptual process, and that, for example, there's evidence showing that how you discriminate depth for an optic flow stimulus differs depending on whether you're moving in relation to the stimulus actively or whether you're being passively moved in the same way in relationship to it. That active versus passive movement of the body affects the content of your perception. And then in the case of, say, something like mental imagery or simulation, visualization processes, you reenact those kinds of sensory motor processes in an emulatory way, and that depends on the body and its sensory motor capacity. So all that is included in what I mean by embodiment.
Okay, so a fair amount of that shouldn't be all that controversial. I
don't think that it's a recognized movement in cognitive science, and cognitive science has a lot of different viewpoints, but it was controversial maybe 25 yeyears ago, but I'd say it's much less controversial today.
Okay. So let's talk about now, let's start talking about more, you might say, exotic forms of consciousness, starting with one that's not that exotic because we've all experienced it, but dreaming. Mm-hmm. What do you make of dreaming? I don't mean in the Freudian sense, but more in the, kind of metaphysical sense.
Well, the reason I'm interested in dreaming, and I distinguish under the heading of dreaming between the experience of falling asleep, what psychologists call hypnagogic imagery or the hypnagogic state, which is the state leading into sleep, versus dreaming in a more full-blown sense. What interests me about those states is that the sense of self in them shifts in certain interesting ways. So in the hypnagogic state, there's more of a kind of spectator watching sense of awareness where you're kind of absorbed in the image and held to it. Sometimes you can, intentionally move it and it's highly suggestible, but you don't have that feeling really of being fully immersed in a world that is the case when you wake up and report a dream. I was doing something, or someone was chasing me. So there's the interesting thing about the dream state is that it's, in one sense, it's entirely a state of your mind, but within that state of awareness, you make a self non-self distinction. You mark what in the dream is self versus what in the dream is non-self, even though it's all a mental generation of
which you do in waking life as well, right?
Exactly, which you do in waking life as well. I mean, in some sense, this is all, within the field of my awareness, but of course I differentiate what's me versus what's you. And in the dream state, that is also happening, but the dream state is an auto-generated state. I think of it as a state of spontaneous imagination occurring during sleep that has a self-experience structure to it, a self-other structure.
Yeah, now why do you say that it should be considered imagination, not delusion? I mean, isn't it delusion if you think it's real? I mean, when I imagine something in during the day, I'm usually not under the impression that it's real. But in a dream, you typically are, unless it's lucid dreaming.
Right. So, strictly speaking, I think that dreaming is really sui generis, and there are aspects of it that are like imagination and aspects of it that are like hallucination. I think that it flattens out the unique characteristics of the experience to say it's just delusional hallucination during sleep, because I think that misses the way that the imagery in dreaming resembles in some ways waking imagination. Because if you think about the dream, where your attention is in the dream determines what the content of the dream is. In exactly the way when you try to visualize something, if you try to visualize the Eiffel Tower, well, the image is there before your mind only as long as your attention is placed there. And if you shift your attention to something else, then you're no longer imaging the Eiffel Tower. And that seems to me very similar to the way dreams work, that dreams kind of jump with your attention from image to image, and you cognitively frame them in a narrative way, especially when you tell the dream from the waking state perspective. And that seems to be more like imagination than like perception. So that's why I emphasize the imaginative aspects of the dream state.
Yeah, I mean, often it seems to me like that my dreams, at least, which are maybe more incoherent than the average person's, but they seem so kind of incoherent that what seems to be going on is like each kind of episode of the dream is almost being independently generated by my brain, and then part of me is weaving it into a story. Right. But there's not a very natural and organic connection among the things you could call episodes.
Yeah, I think that that's actually very interesting to think about phenomenologically and also culturally, because we have certain practices that vary across cultures in terms of how we think about our dreams and their meaning and how we narrate them from the perspective of the waking state. So, for example, I quote this in my book. There's a story by Borges where he says, well, imagine a simple dream. First, I dream the image of a man, then I dream the image of a tree, and then waking, I can give it a structure it didn't have. I can say I dreamed, a man turned into a tree. So you narrate it in a way that creates a story out of it. But if you were to try to reflect in a more precise phenomenological way, you might decide that actually it's better to just say first this image, then this image. And the narration comes about from the waking practice of telling the dream as a story. Mm-hmm. It's not to say all dreams are like that, but that affects how we think of what the dream is.
Right. And of course, our minds construct stories in waking consciousness,
right,
too. I mean, we construct theories about why things happen. We put together diverse data and say, okay, here's the overall thing that connects them. And in various other ways, we weave stories. So what's this term hypnagogic? Is that it for?
Yeah. So hypnagogic is just from the Greek meaning leading into sleep. And it's the term that's used to refer to sleep onset experiences. So as you're falling asleep, you might see bizarre images or hear funny sounds, and you're not quite sure whether they're in your head or whether they're in the room, or you have thoughts that seem meaningful, but you can't quite fathom the meaning. If you were to wake up, you sort of lose hold of what the meaning is. So this is very typical of sleep onset. It's less common to talk about it in our culture, I think, because, we lead very busy, stressed lives and we crash as we go to sleep. And so you just kind of fall through that state very quickly. But if you read Proust, for example, there's long, very detailed passages about these hypnagogic reveries that happen in falling asleep. Or Nabokov has some wonderful descriptions as well. So it's a different kind of state in that physiologically it's at the onset of sleep, the wake to sleep transition. And the phenomenological characteristics are different from dreaming, which involves this sense of immersion, of being in a dreamscape or being in a dream world, whereas the hypnagogic experience is more spectatorial. It's as if you're kind of watching a screen.
Yeah, although that phase for me passes pretty quickly. You gotta, and pretty soon you're immersed. I mean, I sometimes, if I'm tired, I'm working and I'm tired, I'll just set my alarm for like 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and you will have these little like bursts of, and then kind of, of like imagery or conception, and then you'll know, you'll kind of wake up, and it's interesting, like for the nap to have been refreshing depends on, for me, on some degree of actual immersion, just like 2 seconds, right? It's like I get to the point where I go, okay, that was like a dream. Even if it's only 2 seconds. It seems like in the past there have been times when I could actually witness things I was thinking about consciously morphing into, like being transformed into imagery or something, but that has not happened much lately. I maybe the older you get, the less agile you are in that way. But does this sound like standard?
Yeah, I think that's a familiar thing that many people describe, and it's actually what you were just describing is one reason why people who are interested in lucid dreaming and various kind of techniques to induce lucid dreaming talk about using the hypnagogic state, because there's still this borderline awareness, and if you can keep that as you go into the immersed state, then you can actually have it occur as a lucid dream, a dream in which you're dreaming.
So then lucid dreaming, this brings us to lucid dreaming. Have you seen the movie Waking Life, by the way? You must have.
Yeah, I have, yeah.
I recommend it. It's by the guy who did Boyhood, the much celebrated Boyhood, Richard Linklater. So what do you make of lucid? I actually just a couple nights ago had a moment of lucidity where like, okay, this is a dream. I'm not really flying up the escalator. What do you make of... And there's variations, right? I mean, you can be aware but not in control, and you can be aware and saying, "Oh, I want this to happen now," and it happens, right?
Right. Yeah. So for me, the minimal feature of lucid dreaming is really being able to shift your attention to the state as dream-like. And that doesn't necessarily mean you can control the dream. And typically, even when you can control the dream, it's only within certain limits. So it's the idea that you have a certain kind of state awareness. You become aware of the state as dreamlike, and that can differ in its depth. So very, very strong lucidity, you can actually know that you're asleep in bed. You can remember previous lucid dreams you've had. You can use those to inform the current lucid dream you're having. But that is not necessarily present in a less lucid dream where you just have some sense, oh, this is a dream, and you might not have the awareness of actually being asleep in bed. You just know, oh, this state is a dream. And it's interesting because it implies another shift in the structure of self-experience that I was talking about. Because if you think I am dreaming versus I am flying, well, the I in the I am dreaming refers, as it were, to the body that you have in the dream, the mental image you have of yourself in the dream. But the I am dreaming or the I am sleeping refers to yourself in the bed. So you have a complexification in the structure of how you can experience yourself when you're in that kind of a state.
Mm-hmm. Is there a way to fill out this analogy? Lucid dreaming is to dreaming, or lucidity during the dream is to dreaming, as blank is to ordinary consciousness?
Well, many contemplative or meditative traditions, especially Asian ones, work with precisely that kind of analogy. So the idea is that this waking state is one in which we're kind of typically immersed in it in an unreflective or unmindful way. Mm-hmm. And waking up to our involvement in how it's constituted is analogous to waking up in a dream. And indeed, the word Buddha literally means the awakened one. So it's a play on that idea of being truly awake to what everybody else, thinks is real, and seeing through it in a way. So lucid dreaming is a very kind of powerful experiential analogy for that idea.
So then mindfulness in a kind of a deep sense, not just in the sense of, meditation for stress reduction or something,
Right.
but mindfulness in a deep sense would be to ordinary consciousness as lucidity during a lucid dream is to the dream.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And, there you start getting into some heavy territory, right? I mean, you might say, into the question of what consciousness is. Because you might say, well, what during mindfulness, what is it that's doing the observing? Has there been a kind of a separation of substance almost? There's been a separating out of an extracting from ordinary consciousness of something that can be the seer in a way there wasn't a seer before, or what? What do you make of it?
Yeah, so that's a very complicated question, and it's in many ways a debate that runs throughout the history of Indian philosophy, and it's a debate we see in contemporary philosophy of mind. But I see that capacity for meta-awareness as, let's say, itself a cognitive capacity that we all have. I don't see it as a separate, independent self. Some Indian traditions do. Some Indian traditions basically say it's a mistake to think your mind is yourself. Rather, that witness is the true self. That's the yoga view. That's the Vedanta view.
So there's a witness consciousness that's separate from what we think of as ordinary consciousness, but it takes discipline to really almost purify it.
Exactly. That's exactly the classical Indian yoga perspective. Whereas I would say that, my perspective is one where it doesn't point to a separate or independent self, a sort of self-standing witness behind the scenes. It's rather a cognitive capacity that we have to be aware of our awareness. That's what psychologists call meta-awareness. And it's crucial for any kind of mindfulness practice, either in the stress reduction sense or in a deeper sense of really trying to be more present to your involvement in how the world is that you experience and that you participate in creating. So that's how I see it. I don't see it as referring to a separate self that would be a independent witness or a substance or a disembodied soul, for instance.
But doesn't awareness of awareness sound like the kind of thing that should be in principle impossible?
Well, we know that we have, as part of our human endowment, capacities of metacognition. So we can think about our cognition, and there's good psychological evidence that includes being able to monitor and track certain aspects of awareness, and that can be trained through certain kinds of practices, especially meditation practices. So there is a question that philosophers debate about, well, is awareness in its very nature got a kind of reflexivity to it, so that awareness is in some very basic sense always a kind of self-awareness. That's the so-called reflexivity view of consciousness, for which I have a great deal of sympathy. But that's different from the kind of higher order meta-awareness that we were just talking about. That would be something that would just belong to the nature of consciousness itself, without necessarily meta-awareness as a distinct cognitive process being part of the process.
With meta-awareness, there's a seeming almost distancing from what you're observing relative to your ordinary level of involvement.
Yeah, I think that's typically the case for meta-awareness in maybe more unskilled or inexperienced cases. I think certain kinds of meditation practices train that meta-awareness so that it becomes spontaneous and not as if it's a separate intervening higher order awareness. It just enhances the sensitivity of awareness itself. And it's meta in the sense that you're able to be aware of qualities that belong in a way to awareness rather than, independent out there in the world, qualities of your own, phenomenal experience. So it's awareness of awareness, but it doesn't have that higher order intervening feeling when it's something that becomes more practiced.
Right. Although even when it doesn't feel so much like you're objectifying the contents of your mind and your impulses and so on, and so it doesn't feel like there's a distance, a here and a there. Still, there's in some sense a lessened engagement of certain things because you are less enthralled by things like anger and fear.
Right.
That you might witness, but they don't grab you. So there isn't that kind of proximity.
Yes. So in that sense of proximity, what some scientists or psychologists would call a kind of experiential fusion, where you're sort of fused to your experience or stuck to it, that is lessened through that kind of meta-awareness practice, because something that involves, an experience of anger you're not going to be stuck to it and attached to it in the same way. You're going to be able to notice, that's anger, and you can have a way of dropping it, as it were, or being less stuck to it. So that's, psychologists call that decentering or de-reification of experience, or reducing experiential fusion. There's all these different words that psychologists use for that, but that would be what you'd be talking about.
But you're saying
there.
that doesn't necessarily mean you feel there's like a great distance between you and it. It's a different kind of disengagement.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so then dreaming, lucid dreaming, so on, and then finally, as you note in the book, there's in Indian tradition, in Indian philosophy, there is this claim that some have made that even when you're not dreaming and you're asleep, there is some level of awareness of that. Mm-hmm. Count me out as someone who's observed that, and I would question what exact kind of evidence there could be for that, or what even introspective evidence would seem like, but. Has science told us anything about that, or the plausibility of that, or
not really, as far as I know. I think what I call the default neuroscience way of talking about consciousness is to say consciousness is that which disappears in dreamless sleep and reappears in waking and dreaming, and I think that's a very problematic description, because it's true that our ability to hold certain things in memory and select things attentionally, that certainly breaks down in dreamless sleep. We know that behaviorally, we know that neurophysiologically, but whether that means that consciousness in any sense, what philosophers would talk about under the heading of phenomenal consciousness, mm-hmm. the sense of consciousness as felt awareness, whether that's completely gone in dreamless sleep, I don't think we really know that. So the idea that there may be phases or modes of dreamless sleep in which there's a kind of subtle felt awareness seems to me very much an open question. And I talk about this in the book because it's a big subject of philosophical debate in the Indian traditions, the idea that there may be this subtle awareness in deep sleep.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what is your main takeaway from a consideration of dreaming and lucid dreaming compared to ordinary consciousness, in terms of your overall mission of trying to figure out consciousness and self to the extent that that's possible?
Well, with regard to self, I think they all point to the idea that, as I say in the book, the self is a process, not a thing. It's a process under constant construction. Those constructive processes are biological, psychological, social. They shift across these different states. So the states are very revealing for how that happens in different ways. I also think these states point to the what you might call the spontaneity of consciousness, that consciousness is, let's say, self-organizing. The brain is self-organizing and spontaneous in its activity. It never shuts down except, of course, in death. So it's constantly generating activity. And in the waking state, this is under the modulation of, the body engaged in its tasks and mental deliberation. And then that spontaneous activity doesn't go away when you fall asleep and dream. It just shifts in its character. So it speaks to me to the importance of seeing consciousness as a spontaneous self-organizing phenomenon, rather than something that's dictated by the stimulus in any straightforward way.
Okay. So it's a constructive... I mean, we're constructing, you're saying, both the view of reality, so to speak, and the self, and the conception of the self.
Right.
And you distinguish between the self being a construction and the self being an illusion, as classic Buddhism would have it.
That's right.
And that seems like a pretty subtle distinction. You want to talk about that?
Yeah. So there are many different Buddhist lines on the self, but the standard line would be something like the sense of self that we have, the experiential sense of self, is an illusion because it involves the illusion of there being some substantial self that continues to exist from moment to moment, and that was the same when we were kids and now we're, adults, and that if you look for a substantial self like that, you won't find it. That sense of self-identity is in a way a fiction. It's fictional, not real. And my view is different in that I think that these processes that I was just talking about, these constructive processes, make a self-construct, and that self-construct has a lot of functional value for us. For example, autobiographical memory is crucial to, knowing you have a personal history and come from a family and you're part of a tradition. And I think of that as having biological, psychological, and social functions, so that it's misleading to say that it's an illusion. I think it's a construction, and constructions can be real. Not all constructions are fictitious. I mean, if you build a building, it's a real building, right? So I think the self is like that. It's a real construct. I also think that from what religious scholars would call a soteriological perspective, that is, Buddhism is soteriologically about overcoming that self-illusion.
Soteriology referring to salvation?
Right, to the idea of liberation or salvation, spiritual
liberation. In a Christian context, that would mean you accept Christ as your Savior, you're assured of an afterlife. In Buddhism and Hinduism, it means something else. More like, as you say, liberation, release from something.
Exactly, right. So for Buddhists, it would be liberation from ignorance and suffering. And crucial for liberation from ignorance and suffering would be overcoming the illusion of self. And that's tricky, I think, for me, because I think that the self-construct plays functional roles. And so if you understand the illusion of overcoming the illusion of self as meaning, as some Buddhists do, no longer having autobiographical memory, a sense of self and autobiographical memory, or no longer having intention, but just kind of responding in an immediate way that reduces suffering and increases compassion, but without that kind of mental self-narrative, that's not something that I personally want to aspire to, that I would, hold up as an ideal of liberation. So that connects to me with the idea that the self is a construct, and it's an important construct, and it plays a role, and eliminating it is misguided.
Okay, although one way, I guess,
it's not that all Buddhists say that. It's just that's one Buddhist line.
And another way to look at it, liberation is also described in Buddhism as involving overcoming thirst, craving and aversion, right? Craving for things and aversion to things. And when you think about it, it's craving and aversion. This is not a thought that's original to me, but craving and aversion. In fact, I got this from someone named Miri al-Bahari, who wrote a book called Analytical Buddhism. It's very interesting. I think I got it from her. Now I'll probably go on to distort the idea so that she wouldn't claim it. But anyway, the basic idea was that craving and aversion, which is a whole lot of life. A whole lot of life is finding things either pleasing or unpleasing, trying to distance yourself from them or approach them and acquire them and so on. That those two things do a lot to define the bounds of self. When you want something, you're trying to bring it into contact with this thing you think of as yourself. When you don't want something, you're trying to distance yourself from this thing you call the self. So in a certain sense, to the extent that, attraction and aversion or thirst and aversion are define the self, A, and B, if overcoming them is liberation, then you can see a sense in which a certain conception of the self is dissolved upon liberation if you lose your clinging and your aversions, right? So that's one way of looking at it. Now that is on the other hand maybe a different conception of self from the autobiographical self. And I take it your point there is partly that, okay, the autobiographical self is not a completely faithful, objective and non-selective rendering of your whole history. On the other hand, it has a kind of correspondence to reality. It's not totally invented.
Right. It certainly has aspects that are illusory. We know that memory is highly constructive. It's not as if it's, a faithful replica of past experience, but its highly constructive nature is functionally very important and serves very important roles. So the idea that liberation would mean no longer having that kind of sense of self that is presented in autobiographical memory, that seems problematic to me. I like Miri al-Bahari's analysis in terms of craving and aversion, and how she relates that to the idea of a self as a bounded entity that we identify with. I think that's a very good analysis. I think she again emphasizes the illusion side of things and neglects the positive construction side. That would be my argument with her. And indeed, we have argued about this together. So
I see.
Yeah.
It could also be the case that it's an illusion, but a pragmatically useful illusion. I mean, it's,
Yeah.
It might be that if you let go of it, you die, but it was still an illusion. That's in principle possible.
Right. Well, I mean, in the case of death, I think it's important to be able to let go to the attachment to those kinds of constructions. That's also something I talk about in the book, because I think that is necessary for an experience of death that's I wouldn't use the word good as a loaded word, but maybe authentic way of meeting death, rather than meeting it in a way where you're just clinging to certain images of self that you don't want to let go of. So I do think that that's important. So as with all constructions, you have to know when they're useful and when not to use them. Exactly.
Okay. So why don't we move on to a more exotic experience that many of us have not had, like the near-death experience. And there's a chunk of your book is available as a kind of on Amazon as a really very the chunk that is devoted to near-death experiences is available for very little money in Kindle form.
Right, it's the short book. The chapter on death is separate as a short ebook. Right.
So, talk about the near-death experience.
Well, the near-death experiences are experiences that I think are extremely interesting. I don't think we understand what exactly is happening in those experiences. I got interested in them because I was sent an email by a near-death experience researcher when he read some earlier papers of mine about the neuroscience of consciousness, and said, I like your approach combining neuroscience and phenomenology, but I think near-death experiences really pose a challenge to the neuroscientific study of consciousness, because there are things like verifiable out-of-body perception and experiences happening when the brain is shut down. And I knew about these experiences anecdotally and from popular culture, and I thought, well, if there's really scientific evidence that says that, then that's something really important that we need to know about. So I went in and just kind of read as much of the scientific literature as I could, and came out on the other side rather skeptical, not about the robustness of these experiences. I think they're genuine experiences, certainly, but the way that they are often interpreted as definitely showing that the brain is shut down when they occur, or that there's definitely verifiable out-of-body perception in the case of near-death experiences. I believe that a careful examination of the literature doesn't support that interpretation. Now, it could be in the future, maybe there would be data that would support that interpretation. It's not as if I think that's not, possible, but I don't see that support there yet. So I take near-death experiences, at least at the present state of evidence, as indicating from a biological perspective things about what happens to the brain in crisis situations. We're talking about near-death experiences during cardiac arrest in particular, during the entrance into a cessation of normal brain activity, and then on the other side during the resuscitation. So, as I say, I think that the evidence isn't strong for, let's call them, spiritualist interpretations. At the same time, I think that materialist interpretations don't work either, because we don't have a materialist neuroscientific explanation of consciousness. This is the great mystery, that consciousness isn't understandable in neuroscience terms, and may never be, and that might be the entirely wrong way of thinking about it. So these are experiences that are extremely provocative in that way, because they point to the limits of our knowledge. I think also the one other thing I would say, and I try to emphasize this in the book, is that the experiences need to be studied for what they might tell us about what it's like to die under certain conditions, and that the phenomenological perspective is extremely important. And that's something our culture shies away
Phenomenological
from.
meaning your experience is viewed from inside, the first person
Exactly.
subjective report of what it's like to be you.
Exactly, right. We have an amazingly technical and increasingly sophisticated biomedical knowledge of what happens to an organism as it starts to break down in the dying process, but it's not complemented at all by an equally sophisticated perspective on the first-person experience of what it is to die. Of course, hospice workers, have a pragmatic knowledge of this because they work with this every day. Palliative care physicians. But we don't really have, despite their know-how, we don't really have in our culture a body of knowledge that we can point people to about, something that we're all going to face. And I think the near-death experiences bring this out in a very, very vivid way, because the ones that happen under cardiac arrest happen because we have ways of resuscitating people that we didn't, used to have.
So they can recount what it was like before the resuscitation really kicked in. It seems like I recall somebody saying they actually did a study, because every once in a while somebody who's resuscitated says, I was floating above my body and saw my body. Didn't somebody actually put, like on the top of bookshelves or something you would be able to see if you were really up where the ceiling is, and none of these people could ever tell you what it was?
Well, they have done studies. This is Sam Parnia's team have done studies where they put things that would be out of view to an ordinary perspective, but if you were to be, floating up by the ceiling, you would be able to see them. And there were no cases of reported near-death experiences in those rooms in a way that, made it possible to actually test this. So there's no positive evidence. There's no obvious disconfirming negative evidence either, though I'm skeptical that whole experimental paradigm is really meaningful and is going to work. But it could. It's an open question.
Have you ever heard the actor Christopher Reeve, who's no longer alive, who played Superman? Have you ever heard his account of his near-death experience?
I don't think so.
It's kind of interesting. He was this is years before he actually died. And I think what brought him back was a shot of adrenaline or something, or epinephrine or something. So it was a case where they gave him an injection of something that brought him back. And I think he did talk about hovering above. But the interesting thing to me was he pinpointed the moment of death as kind of a moment of surrender, in the sense that, like, this is just too much work. To keep this body going under these circumstances is just too much work. And I'm wondering, is that a common? Have you come across that before? Because that naturally suggests notions of will as a metaphysical kind of thing that might be associated with consciousness.
Yeah, people report different kinds of things. They report a feeling of surrender, of not really wanting to return to the body, feeling pulled back, feeling they have to go back, deciding to go back because of family members.
It's a decision that's interesting.
Yeah, I think those are all aspects of the experience that really need investigation. The volitional aspect that can ensue. Of course, we don't know about experiences in which someone decided the volition in another way, and as a result may have died. We wouldn't have access to that. Well, but in this case,
there was that moment for Christopher Reeve. He decided to die, and then they gave him an injection. So presumably he would have died. We don't know for sure. Right. But that's the moment he's recounting, and he just said it was so much work. It was just too hard. He said, this is just too hard.
Also, when you read accounts of people dying in hospice, there's often, people struggle and people fight, and then they experience a feeling of relief and letting go, and then the dying process becomes much easier. And hospice workers recount this over and over again, that this is actually crucial to, if you have a terminal illness and dying is inevitable in hospice, to be able to let go of that kind of construction of the ego that's making you fight. And people really struggle with that, and there comes a point where they're able to let go, and that makes the whole dying process much easier. in the social setting of the hospice with family members, and also presumably, for the person who's dying.
And in those cases, it's not just a moment of release. You're saying that they kind of make that decision, and then for days on end, they're at peace with the fact?
And then it can vary the amount of time that ensues after that. It might be that, they're alive only for a few more minutes, or they might continue to live for days, but there's that sense of peacefulness that's often recounted after a struggle like that.
Mm-hmm. So then what about out-of-body experiences? I don't think I've ever quite had one. Does that necessarily involve feeling that you have an actual perspective that's in somewhere other than your head, or can it be subtler than that?
Well, the usual out-of-body experience is one in which you see your body from the outside. So it's a so-called autoscopic phenomenon. And if it's an out-of-body experience, say, that occurs spontaneously during sleep or sleep-wake transitions, which is often when they can happen, you may have a sensation of floating up by the ceiling. So you have kind of vestibular, gravity feelings, and you see an image of yourself asleep in the bed that's down below you. So you have this kind of dissociated experience of embodiment. On the one hand, your visual perspective and your vestibular perspective are up at the ceiling, so that's an aspect of embodiment. But then you see a visual image of yourself in the bed below you, so that's a visual representation of your body. So ordinarily these are integrated, right? But these come apart in the out-of-body experience. So it's a kind of dissociated or altered embodiment, you could say.
And you, I gather, don't have any reason to believe, any more than in the case of the near-death experience, that consciousness is kind of actually hovering, right? I mean, you would guess that it's more a construction, an imaginative feat?
Yeah, I think it's a cognitive construction, or I think the evidence supports that interpretation. I've had out-of-body experiences; they feel very real. So while you're having them, I had them when I was 9, 10 years old. When you have them, they seem very real, and it's very difficult not to believe that you really are up, floating up there at the ceiling. But there's no evidence that supports the idea that there's an ethereal body floating up there by the ceiling. I think it makes much more sense to interpret it as a kind of cognitive construction that you have, because you're not integrating sensory information in the normal way. Okay.
So do you take anything in particular away from the out-of-body experience, or for that matter, the near-death experience, again, in the context of your overall mission of kind of understanding consciousness and self?
Well, the out-of-body experience, I think, speaks to the way that our bodily sense of self is a construction, because you have to integrate the signals. Your brain and body are in constant dialogue. They have to integrate the signals in the right way, and in out-of-body experience, that comes apart. So that speaks to the normal integrative constructive processes. In the case of near-death experiences, some involve out-of-body experiences as a component, some don't. And I think what's most important about those, I think, is really understanding what happens to consciousness in dying from a phenomenal, an experiential perspective. That's again, I think, what we so lack in our culture in terms of how we deal with death.
But it is conceivable. I mean, leave aside the sense that you're floating above or anything like that, but more in terms of the kind of thing we were discussing with Christopher Reeve, sense of surrender and so on. I mean, it is conceivable that some part of some near-death experiences are actually saying something about the relationship of consciousness to the physical body, assuming you think there's a distinction to begin with, which not everybody does. But, right, it's possible that there's a relationship that is entered into between, something you could call consciousness that's not in itself material and the material body, and then the relationship ends, and right? I mean, that's conceivable.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what that means, in the sense that we'd have to really think about what exactly we mean when we use a word like material or physical. Mm-hmm. If we mean, something that doesn't fit into our present understanding of how the brain works, I think that's entirely plausible. If we mean something that's by nature not physical, then we don't even understand exactly what it is for something to be physical, even in the terms of physics. So the concepts seem to me to kind of stretch to a point of losing their applicability in that case.
Right. No, I certainly agree that the common sense understanding of material as hard stuff, stuff you bump into, is kind of not borne out by physics. And I sometimes think that really when we talk about the material world, what we mean is that it's just that there's regularity and it's amenable to laws. But there's something else we mean, and you kind of get into I mean, there is, notwithstanding the difficulty of defining material in clear terms, there is a distinction to be noted between what we call the material world and the conscious world, which is to say, whatever the material world out there is, we can view it from the outside, so to speak, such that you and I can both look at the same thing and usually come to some sort of agreement as to what it is, or at least disagree on the basis of evidence, whereas when I talk about my consciousness, you just don't have access to it. And when you talk about yours, I don't have access to it. So the material world complies with the requirement of science that for a phenomenon to be studied by science in the classic sense, it has to be publicly observable. More than one scientist can look at it, because that way more than one can do the experiment and they can compare the results. But so there is a distinction that you can posit, and that I think you make, as I understand it, even without having a complete understanding of what either the material world or the conscious world is.
Yeah, certainly we can make an epistemological, phenomenological distinction between the ways that I have, access to the book on my shelves versus the ways that I have access to your experience, say. I mean, I know about your experience empathetically through our, shared experience of being humans and communicating in language and our understanding of gesture and facial expression and all those things. So it's, empathy is the mode of second person understanding, and science, when it's, sort of quantitative physical science, doesn't use empathy. Social science can use it, but certainly, physics doesn't use it. So that's of course, those are differences in method and in how we know things. What those signify in terms of the difference in the ontology or the being of consciousness, however, is not so straightforward. So it doesn't follow from those differences that consciousness is non-physical, whatever that exactly means.
Right.
So that's more
right.
Now there would be a question, however, so maybe this would be another way of coming at the point at issue. There would still be a question about whether, leaving out terms like physical and non-physical and what they could possibly mean, whether there are aspects of consciousness that are contingent on the brain or aspects that transcend the brain. And I think that's an open question. I don't think we can just say that we know the answer to that question. I don't think evidentially we're in a position to have good reason to think that consciousness does transcend the brain and the body. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't. There's lots of things we don't understand, and we don't have an explanation of consciousness in terms of the brain. So that's the problem.
In a way, the view that seems to me is actually presumed in the behavioral sciences, although not many behavioral scientists think about this. But the view that's presumed is that subjective experience, consciousness, is entirely contingent on the physical. And I mean, because the assumption is that if you had a complete physical model of an organism down to the last atom, you'd understand it completely and could predict the thing it would do next and so on, so that's kind of, causally closed and isn't getting any input from consciousness, which is intuitively an appealing view. But if it's true, then you have to ask, well, what is consciousness for? Not that consciousness has to be for something, but it raises a question of why it would be here. And in any event, even in that view, these are different kinds of things. So even this so-called epiphenomenal view of consciousness doesn't claim that consciousness is just the physical. It just says it's completely dependent on the physical, but leaves open the idea that it's still somehow different.
Yeah, I would say my view is that the terms of the problem, the terms with which we discuss the problem, basically make it insoluble. So, I mean, to put it another way, I think that there would really need to be a deep revolution in our understanding of what it is for something to be physical, or what it is for something to be natural, in order for us to understand consciousness, because in those terms, because we've constructed our whole understanding of the natural world by methodologically removing consciousness from it. That's what modern science did. And, it pops back in some peculiar ways in quantum physics where, we have to take account of the measurement, but that's not really consciousness. So our whole representation of nature was created mathematically by taking out the consciousness. And now we try to take that method and turn it back on the consciousness and fit it into a representation that got constructed by removing the consciousness. So I don't think that there's any real way that we can do that. We just oscillate back and forth between these different alternatives like, dualism or materialism or epiphenomenalism. And we would really need to, I think, have a kind of revolution in the concepts that we use, like the concept of what it is to be physical or the concept of what it is to be natural, where those concepts wouldn't by design exclude the mental or exclude consciousness. And science is not there at the moment. Maybe it will be at some point in the future, but that's not where it is now. And moreover, the other thing I would add is that from my perspective, all of science takes place against the precondition of conscious experience. All of science depends on observation and measurement and intersubjective agreement and communities of investigators, and that's all contingent on consciousness.
Well, it isn't. It isn't. I mean, you can imagine a robot that has no consciousness, but, it observes the experimental results. It types them out. Another robot observes what's typed and is capable of, without consciousness, doing the algorithm that determines whether these data comply or line up with its data. In principle, you can describe every part of human functioning without reference to consciousness, except the part where we talk about our subjective states. Even that, some people think you could, but anyway, you take my point, kind of.
I take your point, but I don't agree with it, because I don't think in that scenario there's any meaning present. I think the kind of meaning that we're talking about when we talk about the meaning of a scientific statement or an equation or a model requires consciousness. So that scenario doesn't give me science. It gives me, I'm not sure what it gives me, actually.
Okay, I will say that I pick up this smartphone and I ask it a question, and it's answering increasingly sophisticated questions for me. And I don't think it's
sure for you as a conscious experiencing subject. That's certainly true.
Right, but it presumably doesn't have consciousness yet. In some sense, it's taking in my meaning correctly and generating meaningful results. It's an interlocutor in some sense.
It's an interlocutor in the context of a culture, if a context of cultural practices in which consciousness is present, but in and of itself, I don't think that it is.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, let's see. Seems like there was something else. Well, when I asked, isn't it possible that the near-death experience is the ending, or almost, the ending of the relationship between consciousness and the being, which is no longer going to be in a condition that could sustain the consciousness or something. One thing I had in mind, I know you take seriously, that's, a big part of the point of your book is that we should take seriously a variety of kinds of data, including those resulting, the phenomenology that, the first person accounts of contemplatives, right? Like maybe they're seeing something more clearly than we see it. And one thing, in talking to people who have said they've really let go of the concept of self, one thing more than one of them has said to me is that, in just trying to describe what it's like, is, I say, well, wait, you're still seeing the world from inside your head, right? And they'll say, yeah, but, and one thing more than one has said is, it's as if consciousness is a property of the universe, like there's a field of consciousness, and my head is just one point of access to it. So, if you take these things seriously, then that's one way of conceiving it. And in that case, it's like your head can be a point of access to it so long as your brain is functioning. And if your body's no longer functioning, then it's like you do a little goodbye ritual to the field of consciousness or something, Yeah. So that's what I had in mind.
Yeah, that's very much like things that William James says, for example, the idea that, it's not a producer, it's a receiver or a transmitter, and it needs to be functioning in the right way to be connected to. I think that's entirely possible. There's no way I would want to try to argue that out on any kind of a priori grounds. I think from many contemplative perspectives, those descriptions are quite, let's say, robust. That makes a great deal of sense to describe it that way from a contemplative perspective. At the same time, I think those descriptions can't just be taken at face value. They're embedded in conceptual systems, and they involve interpretation, and different conceptual systems describe them in different ways. In Hinduism, that's because there's one universal Atman that is the self, and Buddhists say no, there's no universal Atman that is the self. So trying to navigate the complex terrain of psychology, of culture, of interpretation with regard to those reports is tricky, but I do think they should be taken very seriously, that we shouldn't just discount them.
Mm-hmm. A related idea that kind of appeals to me sometimes is the idea that there is such thing as pure awareness in some sense, whether you want to conceive of it as a field that transcends everyone or whatever you want to think. There is such thing as pure awareness, and for some reason, like natural selection, the creation of these organisms that give birth to other organisms, I mean, given that natural selection involves self-interest, for some reason, it involves a kind of, you could almost say, a warping of pure awareness, like what a Buddhist, I think, might call a warping of pure awareness, because it involves greed and clinging and aversion and hatred, and that, and then as natural selection progresses, you finally get an organism that's capable of starting right to what contemplatives in our species may do, starting to kind of get back to a purer form of awareness, almost return it to its natural state or something. I mean, that's almost too mythological in a religious sense to be appealing to a philosopher, but you get what I mean?
I think I do. I mean, I certainly understand from, let's say, a philosophical perspective that informs those contemplative worldviews, the idea that awareness is not reducible to anything else, that there's a kind of awareness that isn't that doesn't have to do with the cognitive workings of the mind, and that is, let's say, basal or basic in some way, and then it gets refracted, as it were, in different ways by different organisms depending on their cognitive complexity. I mean, I think that makes I have a lot of sympathy for that. I'm certainly find it an appealing perspective. Yeah. It's again tricky because these concepts of pure awareness are functioning in these different traditions in different ways, and we have to kind of be sensitive to that in a way that the perennialist view in the history of religion, this is the view that all religions are are underlying, say the same thing, they're all one. I mean, I think that doesn't work. So I find what you just said attractive in certain ways, but I wouldn't want to take all the perennialism along with it that has historically been pretty tied up with that viewpoint, because I think it doesn't do justice to all the differences. Is
that an established viewpoint, what I just said? I mean, is there somebody associated with it?
Well, I think it's very much in keeping with phenomenological philosophy. So philosophers like Husserl, maybe certain philosophers in the German idealist tradition might be sympathetic to certain things like that. There are ways of interpreting panpsychism that can render it in that right. way.
Panpsychism being the idea that everything in the universe, even inanimate things, even inorganic matter, has some increment of consciousness or sentience or subjective something.
Right. Or another viewpoint would be what's sometimes called neutral monism. So this would be, take different forms and say Spinoza or William James, the idea that, well, the underlying reality is neither physical nor mental, but can, present in a physical way or in a mental way, depending on, how it's refracted, as it were. And so that it kind of transcends that distinction. So these are definitely views, throughout the history of philosophy that you see. Obviously, they take different forms, they're articulated in different ways, but they're all circling around that idea in one way or another, as I see it.
Is panpsychism making a little bit of a comeback, or is that an illusion?
I wouldn't say it's a majority view, but there are definitely people who are writing about it, and I think it's always going to be there as long as the problem of consciousness is there, because it's one road that you can take to deal with that problem. It's part of the current discussion, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. Final question, and this is a somewhat obscure point, but there has been this belief in some contemplative traditions that consciousness is actually not a continuous thing, but actually it blinks on and off. It's discrete. It's like binary, digital. I've always and I've talked to people who said, serious people, are known as serious meditators, who said they had observed that. Now, I'd always thought, but wait, how could you observe it? I mean, it's consciousness. Consciousness is the observation. How could it be aware of the gaps between the phases of consciousness, right? So I have that question, but I think you think that in any event, I'm curious as to your answer to that question, but you think in any event there's at least some actual data from neuroscience that are consistent with the blinking view of consciousness?
Yeah, there's data from perceptual neuroscience that indicates that what looks like a kind of continuous and seamless field of visual awareness is actually made up of pulses that are discontinuous and that have to do with ongoing brain rhythms and how they kind of parse or frame stimuli into meaningful units. And so under that description, the stream of consciousness isn't a stream in the sense of one continuous flow. It's a stream in the sense of a series of pulses. And there's increasing evidence in neuroscience that for certain aspects of visual perception and tactile auditory perception, also for memory and attention, that it works in that kind of discrete pulsing way. That is in some ways very reminiscent of ideas we see in the history of Buddhist philosophy, where exactly the same idea of consciousness isn't a continuous stream, but it's made up of a kind of discrete pulse of what they would call mind moments. Now, the idea that that's observable in meditation, well, that really depends on what observable means, because if strictly speaking consciousness is discontinuous in that way, then observation has to mean retrospective inference. It has to mean, you're aware of something, then there's a kind of blink, and then retrospectively, you notice that there was a blink, or you infer that there was a blink. So, observation there.
Oh, I see. Because the juxtaposition of like the end of one blink and the beginning of the next, they wouldn't quite match up because reality would have changed.
Yeah, or you would notice that, a thought content is, now one thought content, now another thought content, but you're noticing of it as now different,
right,
is retrospective with regard to the previous one.
Right.
So that's observational in a sense, but it's also retrospective and inferential.
Okay. Well, thank you. I don't think we've totally gotten to the bottom of the mind-body problem or the question of self, but you've certainly made progress in your book. Again, it's called Waking, Dreaming, Being. And it's an unusually articulate and lucid discussion of a subject that is not infrequently discussed in less than completely articulate and lucid terms, I would say.
Oh, thank you.
And it's an intractable subject, so it's hard to describe lucidly and articulately. So thanks so much, Evan. And what are you working on now? Are you working on another book?
I actually am working on a book having to do with death and dying. Trying to really amplify those ideas I was mentioning before of drawing on philosophical resources from ancient philosophy across India, Greece, and China with modern perspectives on death to present a richer philosophical perspective on dying. That
sounds good. And meanwhile, people can buy your your very small book on near-death experiences via Kindle. So, well, when you get to the bottom of this death thing, then you'll have to come back and explain that to us too.
All right.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much.
Okay. Bye-bye.